Sarah's hands trembled as she scrubbed the last dish, the soapy water turning murky with every passing second. The clock on the wall ticked away relentlessly, its sound growing louder in the silence of the kitchen. Her back ached from hours of bending over the sink, her small frame struggling under the weight of the tasks that had piled up throughout the day. Every movement felt like a burden, and she barely had the strength to lift the plate in her hands. She wanted nothing more than to rest for just a moment, to let her body relax, but there was no time for that. Not today. Not ever. She had been cleaning, scrubbing, and cooking for hours, ever since the moment her stepmother had ordered her to start. It was the same every day: wake up before dawn, work through the day with no breaks, and finish after everyone else was already asleep. Sarah had learned long ago that if she didn't get it all done in time, there would be consequences. Her stepmother's harsh words would echo through the house, her father's silence would feel like an accusation. It wasn't just about the chores, it was about making Sarah feel like she was worth less than the rest of them. "Sarah, get those dishes done," her stepmother had said that morning, her voice sharp and commanding. "And don't forget to clean the windows, sweep the floors, and make the bed. I expect everything to be spotless." Sarah didn't argue. She never argued anymore. She simply nodded and got to work, knowing that any delay would bring nothing but trouble. The smell of soap and stale food lingered in the air as she reached for the final plate. Her fingers ached from the constant scrubbing, and her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since breakfast. But there was no time for food. She had to finish the work. Her father would be home soon, and she couldn't afford to disappoint him, too. The clock struck 5:30, and the familiar sound of car tires crunching on the gravel outside made her heart skip a beat. He was home. She had hoped that today would be different, that somehow, everything would be okay. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be. Her father had been distant lately, always distracted, never really seeing what was happening in their home. He didn't see how his wife treated Sarah, how she used her as a maid, as an invisible servant who existed only to do the chores. He didn't see how Sarah's spirit had slowly been crushed, how she had grown quieter, more withdrawn, until she was just another shadow in the house. Her father's voice called out from the hallway, his tone light and welcoming, but there was a coolness to it. "Sarah? Where are you, sweetheart?" She quickly dried her hands on the towel, brushing the stray hairs from her face. She was ready to greet him with a smile, just as she always did. But today, something was different. The air in the house felt thick with tension. She didn't know why, but she could feel it, something was about to change. She just didn't know how bad it would be. She stepped into the living room just as her father entered from the hallway. His eyes brightened when he saw her, but there was something else in his gaze, something cold, something that made Sarah's stomach twist with unease. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice softer now, as he reached down to ruffle her hair. "How's everything going?" Before she could answer, her stepmother's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "She's been working all day, just like always," her stepmother said, her tone dripping with venom. "You'd think she could at least manage to clean up after herself. But no, I have to do everything around here." Sarah's heart sank. She had hoped, no, prayed, that her father wouldn't notice. That somehow, he wouldn't hear the bitterness in his wife's voice. But he had. And now, he was looking at her, his expression changing from warm to confused, then to something darker, something more distant. "Sarah," her father said, his voice quieter now, "what's going on here? Why is your stepmother saying you haven't been doing your chores?" Sarah opened her mouth, ready to defend herself, to explain that she had done everything she could to keep up with the housework. But no words came. Her throat tightened, the familiar lump rising, choking her. Her stepmother stepped forward, her hands on her hips as she stared at Sarah with contempt. "Don't listen to her, Paul," she said, glaring at Sarah. "She's been slacking off again. You wouldn't believe how lazy she is." Paul, Sarah's father, looked at his daughter with growing disbelief. His brow furrowed as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't quite make sense. He had always trusted his wife's word, had always believed that Sarah was the problem, the one causing the tension. But now, there was a shift in the way he was looking at her. It was as if something in him had just clicked. Something wasn't adding up. Sarah held her breath, her eyes darting between her father and her stepmother. She didn't know what was coming next, but she knew it would change everything. Her father had always been so blinded by his love for his new wife that he never saw what Sarah had been going through. He had never realized the extent of the cruelty, the endless hours of work, the constant humiliation. But today, that was about to change. Her father looked at Sarah for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse. "Is this true?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "Have you been slacking off, Sarah?" For the first time in months, Sarah found the strength to speak. "No, Dad. I haven't. I haven't been slacking off. I've been doing everything you asked." Her father stared at her, his face a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Then why is your stepmother saying this? Why is she upset?" Sarah took a deep breath, her chest tight. She wasn't sure if she was ready to tell him everything. Could she even explain the years of torment, the hours of work, the endless demands that never seemed to end? How could she make him understand that she was nothing more than a maid in her own home? How could she make him see what his wife was doing to her? But just as she was about to speak, something unexpected happened. Her stepmother, perhaps sensing the shift in the air, stepped forward with a cold smile. "I think we should show him, don't you?" she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. Before Sarah could react, her stepmother grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the laundry room. "Come on, show your father what you've been doing all day," she sneered. Sarah stumbled behind her, her mind racing. She had never been this scared. She had never felt so small, so helpless. But she had no choice but to follow. If she didn't, if she tried to fight back, she knew the consequences would be worse. When they reached the laundry room, Sarah's father followed them, his footsteps heavy behind them. Her stepmother flung open the door, revealing the piles of laundry that Sarah had spent hours washing, folding, and putting away. There was a mountain of clothes, shirts, pants, towels, all piled high, stacked almost to the ceiling. "Look at this, Paul," her stepmother said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Look at all the work she's left for me to do. This is what she's been doing all day. She's been sitting around while I've been cleaning up after her." Sarah's heart sank. She had spent the entire day doing this. She had worked until her fingers bled, until her body ached, but it was never enough. It was never enough for her stepmother, and now her father was looking at her, his face a mask of confusion. But then, something shifted. Her father's gaze softened, just for a moment, and Sarah knew. He knew. He could see it now. He could see the truth. Her father turned to her stepmother, his eyes filled with anger and disbelief. "What have you been doing all day?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. For the first time in years, Sarah saw her father stand up for her. And in that moment, she realized that things were about to change. Everything was about to change. Sarah stood in the dimly lit laundry room, her body frozen, her mind racing. Her father had just witnessed the mountain of laundry she'd painstakingly washed, folded, and stacked all day. She had expected anger, her stepmother's anger, of course. But she had never expected her father's reaction to be so quiet. It was as if the world had stopped turning for a moment, and everything was suspended in time. Her father's eyes flicked from her stepmother's face to the pile of laundry. His gaze darkened with confusion, but there was something else there, too, something that Sarah couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was shame. Or maybe it was the sudden realization that something had been wrong all along, and he had never seen it before. He took a step back, his mouth slightly agape, his brow furrowed in disbelief. His hands trembled slightly, and Sarah could see him trying to process everything, the puzzle pieces falling into place one by one. Her father, who had always been her hero, the one person she had trusted with her heart, was now standing in front of her, a stranger. He had never really seen her, never truly understood what she had been going through. And now, with this small glimpse of the truth, it was all coming to light. Paul, her stepmother's voice was sweet, too sweet. A dangerous kind of sweetness. I don't know why Sarah keeps pretending to work so hard. She's clearly not pulling her weight. I've been running this house all by myself, and I can't do it anymore. I'm exhausted. Her stepmother's voice was full of feigned exhaustion, the kind of tiredness that only came from a lifetime of manipulating and controlling everyone around her. But Sarah could see the cracks in her words. She had seen it all before, the way her stepmother made everything about her, how she always twisted the truth to make herself the victim. For years, Sarah had watched as her father blindly accepted her stepmother's narrative, always siding with her, never questioning anything. But today was different. Today, he was seeing things for what they really were. Her father looked back at her, his eyes wide, searching for answers. "Sarah," he began again, but his voice faltered as he struggled to find the right words. Is this true? Have you really been doing all this work? All day?" Sarah opened her mouth to speak, to explain everything that had been happening, but no words came. How could she explain it all? How could she make him understand the years of suffering, the days spent scrubbing and cleaning, always hoping that one day he would notice her pain? How could she make him see the torment she had lived through at the hands of her stepmother? The weight of it all crushed her, and the lump in her throat threatened to choke her. Her stepmother, sensing her opportunity, jumped in. "Look at her, Paul. She can't even speak for herself. She's too lazy to even defend her own actions." Her stepmother crossed her arms over her chest, a smug smile spreading across her face. "She's been getting away with this for months, and I've had enough. You need to make her understand that she can't keep doing this to me." Sarah's chest tightened as the words hit her like a punch to the gut. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. It was all too much. She had been holding everything in for so long, trying to keep the peace, trying to make everyone happy, but now it was all crashing down. Her father's gaze softened again, and for the briefest of moments, Sarah thought maybe, just maybe, he was finally going to stand up for her. Maybe he was going to see the truth and confront her stepmother for all the lies. But then, her father spoke again, his voice low and uncertain. "Sarah, he hesitated, his face clouded with doubt. "I didn't know. I didn't know this was happening. I thought you were. I thought you were doing everything I asked." He trailed off, looking at the pile of laundry with an expression of disbelief. "But now I don't know what to think." Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. The pain in his voice was like a knife twisting in her chest. He didn't even trust her. After all these years, after everything she had done for him, he didn't believe her. Her stepmother moved closer, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Paul, honey, you've been so busy with work, and I understand that. But I've been carrying this house on my own. I can't do it all, not when Sarah refuses to help." Sarah's vision blurred as her stepmother's words echoed in her ears. Her father stood there, looking between the two of them, unsure of who to believe, unsure of what to do. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. She could see the cracks in his eyes, the confusion, the doubt. And it hurt more than anything she had ever felt before. "Paul, I'm begging you," her stepmother continued, her voice softening to a pleading tone. "You need to step up and discipline Sarah. She's out of control, and it's ruining our home. At that moment, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She had to speak, had to say something, or she would explode. She took a deep breath, her voice shaking as she finally managed to get the words out. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been doing everything. I've been cleaning, cooking, doing the laundry. But no matter how much I do, it's never enough. She keeps asking for more, and you don't see it. You don't see what's happening to me." Her father looked at her, his face softening. But before he could respond, her stepmother's voice cut through the silence. "Enough, Sarah," she snapped, her eyes flashing with fury. "Stop making excuses. You're just a lazy little girl who can't do anything right." Sarah's heart shattered at the words. She felt like she was drowning, suffocating under the weight of her stepmother's cruelty and her father's indecision. She had spent so long trying to make him see her, trying to make him understand, but nothing ever worked. It was like she was invisible to him, like she didn't even matter. "I don't care what you say, Sarah," her father finally spoke, his voice tight with frustration. "You've been disrespectful. You've been lazy, and I can't keep ignoring that." The words hit her like a slap in the face. The betrayal, the hurt, it was all too much. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She couldn't. Not in front of them. "Maybe you should leave, Sarah," her father said quietly, his voice full of resignation. "Maybe it's best if you just go." Her world crashed around her. How could he say that? How could he throw her out like she was nothing? Before Sarah could say anything, her stepmother's voice rang out, triumphant and cruel. "Maybe it's time for you to learn your place, Sarah," she said coldly, a malicious glint in her eyes. The world around Sarah seemed to collapse. She was numb, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Her father, the one person she had trusted more than anyone in the world, had just told her to leave. Her stepmother's grip on their lives had become so tight that Sarah couldn't see any way out. But as Sarah turned to leave, her father's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Wait," he said softly, the hesitation in his voice unmistakable. Sarah slowly turned back to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'll look into this," he whispered, almost to himself. "I'll find out what's really going on. Just give me time." In that moment, a small spark of hope ignited inside Sarah's chest. Maybe, just maybe, her father was finally seeing the truth. But she couldn't wait for him to figure it out. The damage had already been done, and she needed to find a way out. As Sarah turned and walked away, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. The journey ahead would be long, but she would not give up. She couldn't. Not when the truth was so close to being revealed. The silence in the house was suffocating. It was as if every breath she took was a reminder of how deeply she had been hurt. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she walked away from her father, the final words he had spoken still echoing in her ears. "I'll look into this, just give me time." Time. Time to figure out what had been happening right under his nose for all these years. Time to see the truth that had been hidden behind lies and manipulation. But Sarah didn't have time. She had already spent years waiting. Years of silently bearing the weight of her stepmother's cruelty, of quietly doing all the chores, of keeping her head down, hoping that one day her father would see what was happening. But he hadn't. And now, with everything on the line, Sarah couldn't wait any longer. She needed to do something. She needed to take control of her life. She slammed the door behind her as she walked into her small bedroom. The walls, once comforting in their familiarity, now felt like a prison. Everything in her room seemed to close in around her as she sank onto the bed, her hands trembling. She buried her face in her hands, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. How could he do this to her? How could he turn his back on her so easily? But Sarah wasn't a child anymore. She couldn't let herself fall apart. Not now. Not when she had come this far. A few hours passed before she heard the soft tap on her door. She didn't need to open it to know who it was. Her father had finally come to find her, to apologize for his harsh words. She had been waiting for this moment all day, hoping for something, anything, that would make her feel like she mattered again. But when she opened the door, she was met with something unexpected. It wasn't her father standing there. It was her stepmother. Her eyes were cold, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her posture was stiff and rigid, like a woman who was preparing for a battle. "Sarah," she said sharply, her voice low and clipped, "you need to come downstairs. Now." Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. She had no idea what this was about, but she had a sinking feeling that it wasn't going to be good. Her stepmother's eyes flickered with something dangerous, something that told Sarah this wasn't just another argument. This was something much worse. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I said, come downstairs," her stepmother repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Your father wants to talk to you." Sarah's pulse quickened. She had been hoping for an apology, but now, she wasn't so sure. She followed her stepmother down the stairs, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the quiet house. When they reached the living room, Sarah saw her father sitting on the couch, his face drawn and tired, as though he had aged years in a matter of hours. As soon as he saw her, he stood up, but there was no warmth in his expression. No sign of the man who had once been her protector, her confidant. Instead, his eyes were cold and distant, and his posture was stiff, almost as if he were preparing for something unpleasant. "Sarah," he began, his voice tight, "we need to talk." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this moment, had even been preparing for it, but now that it was here, she didn't know what to do. Her father's gaze shifted between her and her stepmother, and it was clear that whatever was coming next wasn't going to be easy to hear. "I've been thinking about everything you said earlier," her father continued, his voice low and measured. "And I want to understand what's going on. I know I've been blind to some things, but I'm trying to make sense of it all." Sarah held her breath. Was this the moment when everything would change? Would he finally see the truth? Her stepmother's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Paul, don't you think it's time we get this over with?" she said, her voice laced with false sweetness. "Sarah has been lying to you for months, if not years. You've been deceived. It's time to put an end to it." Sarah's stomach churned at the words. She could hear the malice in her stepmother's voice, the way she twisted the truth to suit her own narrative. Her stepmother had always been good at playing the victim, at making Sarah look like the problem. And now, it seemed, she was about to pull her father even deeper into her web of lies. "I'm not lying, Dad," Sarah said, her voice shaking with frustration. "I've been working non-stop. I've been doing everything you asked me to do, but it's never enough for her." She pointed to her stepmother, her voice rising with the weight of years of pent-up frustration. "She makes me do everything, cleaning, cooking, laundry, and when I can't do it all, she punishes me. She makes me feel worthless. And you never saw it. You never noticed what she was doing to me." Her father's eyes flickered with something, guilt, confusion, but before he could respond, her stepmother jumped in, her voice dripping with venom. "Paul, you're going to believe her lies?" she spat. "Look at her. She can't even keep a simple house clean, and now she's trying to turn you against me. She's the one who's been ruining this family, not me. I've been patient, I've tried to make things work, but she's impossible. She's just like her mother, lazy, disrespectful, selfish. She doesn't care about you, Paul. She only cares about herself." The word stung, but Sarah stood her ground. She wasn't going to let her stepmother manipulate the situation any longer. She had already let too much time slip away, too many chances to stand up for herself had been wasted. "Not anymore. I don't care what you say," Sarah shot back, her voice trembling with anger. I've had enough. I've done everything to please you both. And all you've done is make me feel like I don't matter. I'm done. I'm done being your maid, your servant. I'm done pretending like everything's okay when it's not. I've been living in this house like a prisoner, and I'm not going to keep doing it. Her father's face hardened, and for a moment, Sarah thought he was going to say something that might make it all better. But instead, he took a step back, as if he were suddenly afraid of her. Sarah, he said softly, I don't know what to believe. I don't know who to trust anymore. Your stepmother is telling me one thing, and you're telling me another. How am I supposed to know what's true? His words cut deep, deeper than anything his stepmother had said. It wasn't just his lack of faith in her, it was the realization that her father had never truly seen her at all. He had never really understood the pain she had been living with. He had never truly cared to look. I don't want to live here anymore, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't live in a house where I'm treated like this. Her father's face fell, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw something, regret, perhaps, flicker in his eyes. But it was gone in an instant. I'll make things right, he promised, but his voice lacked conviction. Just give me time. Sarah shook her head. Time. It was the same excuse she had heard her entire life. It was always about time. But time had never been on her side. And now, she was running out of it. With a heavy heart, Sarah turned and walked out of the room, not knowing where she would go, but knowing she couldn't stay there anymore. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally taking control of her own destiny. Sarah's footsteps echoed as she walked out the front door, the door slamming behind her with a finality that made her chest tighten. She stood on the porch, looking out into the dusk, her heart heavy but strangely relieved. The house, the place she had once called home, no longer felt like a safe space. It felt like a cage, a place where every corner held a memory of pain and broken promises. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, trying to feel something other than the exhaustion and heartache that threatened to consume her. But nothing came. No sense of peace. No clarity. Just a hollow emptiness. Sarah had never been a rebellious person. She had always tried to keep the peace, to be the daughter her father wanted, to be the obedient child. She had swallowed her emotions, buried her anger, and put on a smile even when every fiber of her being screamed for help. But now, as she stood there on the porch, she realized something profound: she couldn't do it anymore. The truth had been staring her in the face for years, but it had taken her father's indifference, her stepmother's cruelty, and her own breaking point to finally see it. She had been invisible in that house for far too long. But no longer. She was going to take control of her life, no matter what it took. Turning on her heel, Sarah walked down the driveway, not knowing where she was going but knowing she couldn't stay in that place anymore. She needed to think. She needed to get away from it all, even if it was just for a little while. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out, half expecting it to be a text from her father or her stepmother, telling her to come back, to apologize, to make things right. But it wasn't. It was a message from her best friend, Emma. Hey, I know things have been rough. Want to meet up? We can talk. Sarah smiled faintly, grateful for the small piece of comfort. Emma had always been her safe space, the one person who had never judged her, never made her feel like she wasn't enough. I need to get out of here. Meet you in 15 minutes? Of course. See you soon. With a sigh of relief, Sarah turned and started walking towards the park. It was the one place she had always found solace, where the world seemed to slow down just long enough for her to catch her breath. As she walked, the weight of the day's events began to sink in, and she could feel the tears threatening to break free again. She hadn't cried yet, not since the conversation with her father, but she felt the ache in her chest growing stronger with each step. She had hoped, for so long, that her father would see the truth. That he would look past the lies and manipulations of her stepmother and finally understand what she had been going through. But instead, he had looked at her with doubt, with uncertainty. And in that moment, she had realized something she hadn't been willing to admit before: he would never see her the way she needed him to. The realization stung, a bitter truth she wasn't sure how to process. She had spent so many years trying to make him proud, trying to prove her worth, but nothing had ever been enough. And now, standing in the ruins of what had once been her family, Sarah knew that it was time to let go. It was time to stop trying to make him see her. She had to start seeing herself. The park wasn't far from her house, and she reached it quickly. As she walked through the gates, she spotted Emma sitting on their usual bench, waiting for her. Emma's face softened when she saw Sarah, and she stood up, giving her a tight hug. "Hey," Emma said quietly, pulling back and looking at Sarah with concern. "How are you holding up?" Sarah shrugged, sitting down on the bench beside her. "I don't know," she muttered. "Everything's a mess. My dad doesn't believe me. I can't even look at him the same way anymore." Emma sat quietly beside her for a moment, her hand resting on Sarah's arm in a comforting gesture. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I know how hard this has been for you. It's not fair that he doesn't see what's going on." Sarah blinked back tears, but they still managed to escape, rolling down her cheeks. "I just want him to see me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've been trying so hard, Emma. Trying to be the perfect daughter, trying to make him proud, but he doesn't even notice. He never has." Emma wrapped her arms around Sarah, pulling her close. "You don't need to be perfect, Sarah. You never have. You're enough just the way you are. But I get it. You want him to be the father you've always needed, the one who sees the truth and stands by you. It's not easy when the people we love don't understand us the way we want them to." Sarah clung to Emma, letting the tears come. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to feel everything she had been bottling up. The weight of the years of emotional abuse, the constant striving for approval, the crushing loneliness, it all hit her at once. She had been fighting this battle for so long, and now she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going. "What am I supposed to do now?" Sarah whispered, her voice ragged. "I can't go back there, not after everything. But I don't know where else to go." "You don't have to go back there," Emma said firmly. "You have me. You have your friends. You don't have to do this alone." Sarah nodded, but the uncertainty still lingered in her chest. The world felt like it was falling apart, and she wasn't sure how to pick up the pieces. But one thing was clear: she couldn't stay in that toxic environment any longer. She had to break free. After a long silence, Emma spoke again. "Maybe it's time to take some space from them. You don't have to make any big decisions right now, but you need to figure out what's best for you. Maybe a few days away from everything will help you clear your head." Sarah considered the suggestion, her mind spinning with possibilities. A part of her was terrified of leaving everything behind: her father, her home, the life she had known. But another part of her was beginning to understand something important: she had spent so many years trying to make everyone else happy, trying to fix everything for them, that she had lost sight of herself. It was time to focus on her own happiness, her own well-being. "I think I need to leave," Sarah said softly, more to herself than to Emma. "Just for a little while. I need to figure things out. I need to find myself again." Emma smiled, her eyes filled with understanding. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah. You've got this." The words were a lifeline, a reminder that Sarah wasn't alone. But the road ahead was still uncertain. Her family, the people she had once trusted the most, had become strangers to her. Her father, the man she had always looked up to, had failed her when she needed him the most. But Sarah was no longer the scared little girl who had tried so hard to make him see her. She was stronger now, more determined than ever. She wasn't going to wait for them to change. She was going to change her own life. As Sarah sat with Emma, the weight of the world felt a little lighter. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could take on whatever came next. The decision to leave had been hard, but it was also freeing. Sarah's life had always been filled with constraints, rules, expectations, and invisible barriers she had never been able to cross. But now, as she stood at the edge of something new, she felt a sense of freedom she had never known before. The sun was setting as she walked down the road, her steps purposeful and filled with determination. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay in the life she had known. She needed space, she needed time to clear her mind, to figure out what was truly important. She had to process the weight of everything that had happened and decide what the future would look like for her. Her phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. This time, it was a message from her father. "Sarah, please come home. We need to talk. I want to understand what's really going on. Don't shut me out." She stared at the screen, her stomach knotting. She had expected this, of course. Her father, trying one last time to fix what he felt was broken. He was probably sitting at the kitchen table, pen in hand, ready to apologize, ready to say anything that might bring her back into the fold. But the words she had read earlier still echoed in her mind. How could he understand when he hadn't even bothered to see the truth? How could he truly believe that she was the problem? For years, she had wanted him to see her. To understand her pain, her struggles, her frustrations. But now, that need seemed less important. The only person who needed to understand her now was herself. Sarah quickly turned off her phone and shoved it into her pocket. She didn't want to be distracted. She didn't want to have to explain herself to anyone. She needed time to think, to breathe, to process everything that had led her to this point. Her feet carried her instinctively to the park, the place where she had always felt the most at peace. As she walked along the path, she could feel the weight of the day's events settling on her shoulders. It felt as if everything in her life had been building toward this moment. She had been fighting for so long, fighting for her father's approval, for her stepmother's acceptance, for a sense of belonging. But it had never been enough. She reached the old wooden bench that had been her refuge for years, the place where she had spent countless hours talking to Emma, laughing, crying, sharing her thoughts. She sank onto it now, staring up at the sky, watching as the first stars began to twinkle above her. The quietness of the evening gave her a sense of peace, but it also brought a stark realization. She couldn't keep running away from her problems. At some point, she was going to have to face them. And as much as she wanted to avoid it, the hardest thing to confront would be her relationship with her father. He had been her hero once. He had been the man who promised to protect her, to keep her safe from the world. But somewhere along the way, he had let her down. He had failed to see the suffering she had endured, and now she was left with the painful knowledge that he was more of a stranger to her than ever before. For the first time, Sarah asked herself a question she had been avoiding: was it even worth trying to salvage the relationship? She closed her eyes, allowing the cool evening air to wash over her. There was no easy answer to that question. There was no simple fix. But one thing was clear: she couldn't go back to the way things had been. Not when she had finally found the strength to step away. Just as she was lost in her thoughts, she heard footsteps approaching. Startled, she looked up to find Emma walking toward her, a concerned look on her face. "Sarah," Emma said softly, sitting down next to her. "I've been worried about you. You didn't answer your phone, and I wasn't sure where you went." "I had to get away," Sarah replied quietly. "I just needed space. I needed to breathe, to think." Emma nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I get it. But you can't keep running forever. Eventually, you'll have to face your father and your stepmother. They won't just let you disappear. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I feel like I'm stuck between two worlds. I love my dad, but he doesn't see me. He doesn't see the truth. He just listens to her lies, to her manipulations. I've been invisible in that house for so long, Emma. I don't know how to make him understand. Emma reached out, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's. You can't make him understand if he's not willing to see the truth. You can't make someone see what they don't want to see. But you can take care of yourself. You can stand up for what's right, even if he doesn't. I'm here for you. You're not alone in this. The doorbell rang, its sound echoing in Sarah's chest like the ticking of a clock. She stood there for a moment, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her ears. Every instinct in her screamed to turn around, to walk away, to leave the past behind. But she couldn't. She had come this far. She had to face it. The door opened slowly, and Sarah's father stood in the frame. His face was lined with worry, his eyes red-rimmed, as though he had been waiting for her for hours. For a split second, Sarah wondered if he had been expecting some sort of apology, some tearful reunion, but the moment passed quickly. She saw the same man she had always known, but something was different. He was just as lost as she was. Sarah, he said softly, his voice full of uncertainty. I'm glad you came. I didn't come to talk about the past, Sarah said, her voice steady but firm. I came because we need to talk about now. Her father's brow furrowed, confusion flashing across his face. What do you mean? We've been through this. You left without saying anything. I need to know what's going on. What's really happening? Sarah took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. She had rehearsed what she would say in her mind 1,000 times, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt more important than ever. This was her chance. To be heard. To stop hiding. To finally tell the truth. Dad, I've been trying to make you see me for so long, Sarah began, her voice shaking slightly, but gaining strength as she spoke. I've tried to be the daughter you wanted. I've tried to be the perfect child, the good little girl. But it's never been enough. It's never been what I needed. Her father looked away for a moment, a deep sigh escaping him. Sarah could see the struggle in his eyes, the love he had for her, the confusion over what had happened to their family, and perhaps even a sense of guilt. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. You don't understand, Sarah, he said, his voice low. I've been trying to do what's best for you. I've been working so hard to provide for us, to keep everything together. I don't know how much more I can give. Dad, it's not about what you've given me, Sarah said, her voice breaking but her resolve unshaken. It's about what you've taken away. You've taken away my voice. You've taken away my sense of self. I've been living under your shadow for so long that I don't even know who I am anymore. Her father's face paled, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. What are you talking about? I've always been there for you. I've always tried to be a good father. Yes, you've been there, Sarah agreed, her voice hardening. But you haven't seen me. You haven't seen the pain I've been in. You haven't seen the way she treats me. The way she makes me feel worthless. You've been so focused on keeping the peace, on making her happy, that you've completely ignored what's been happening to me. Her father recoiled as if struck by the words. His eyes darted to the side, and for a moment, Sarah saw a flicker of guilt. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again, unsure of what to say. The truth was sinking in, and it was too much for him to process all at once. You've never stood up for me, Sarah continued, her voice growing more emotional. When she told me to clean the house from top to bottom, when she told me to do everything, and I mean everything, you just let her. You didn't say anything. You didn't even ask me if I was okay. You didn't ask me how I felt. You just sat there, pretending like everything was fine, while she made me feel like I wasn't enough." Her father's face contorted with emotion. "Sarah, I didn't know. I didn't know how bad it was. I thought—" "No, you didn't think," Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. "You didn't even try to see it. You were too busy with work, with your own problems, to notice what was happening under your nose. And now I'm here, broken, because of it." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Sarah felt her chest tighten, the weight of years of pent-up emotions threatening to crush her. She had been holding it all in for so long, but now it was all spilling out. All the hurt, the anger, the disappointment, all of it was laid bare in front of her father, and she didn't know if he could handle it. She wasn't sure if she could. "I'm sorry, Sarah," her father whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know. I didn't see it. I should have." "It's too late for apologies," Sarah said, her voice trembling, but there was no turning back now. "You can't fix this, not now. I've been waiting for you to see me for so long, and now I realize that you never will. You've already made your choice." Her father's face crumpled, the weight of her words sinking in. His lips quivered, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah saw him for what he was, just another person, just as flawed and broken as everyone else. He wasn't the hero she had hoped for. He wasn't the man who would save her. He was just her father, and right now, that wasn't enough. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice thick with regret. "I failed you. I failed to protect you." "You didn't protect me from her," Sarah said quietly, her words softening but still cutting through the air. "You didn't protect me when I needed you most." Her father stood there for a long moment, his face twisted in anguish, his shoulders slumped as if he couldn't bear the weight of his failure. Sarah felt no satisfaction in it. In fact, the ache in her chest only grew. There was no victory in this moment. Just the painful reality that her father, the man she had loved and trusted, had let her down in the worst way. She turned away, her heart breaking with every step, but she knew it was the only way forward. She couldn't stay in this toxic environment any longer. She couldn't keep living in the shadow of someone who couldn't see her, who couldn't protect her. As Sarah walked toward the door, she heard her father call her name. She stopped, but she didn't turn around. She couldn't. "I love you, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Her heart twisted in her chest, and for a fleeting moment, she almost turned back. Almost. But the damage had been done. The love he offered now was a hollow echo of the father she had always wanted him to be. "I know," she whispered, before walking out the door, closing it softly behind her. Sarah finally confronts her father, unleashing her pent-up emotions and revealing the truth about her struggles with her stepmother and her father's indifference. It's a turning point in the story where Sarah realizes that her father's love may not be enough to heal the wounds that have been caused. This chapter sets the stage for Sarah's next steps, her inner journey, and what lies ahead. The night after Sarah left her father's house, she didn't sleep. How could she? Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, hurt, confusion, and, strangely, relief. For years, she had been suffocating in the silence of her family, but now, after confronting her father, there was a stillness. A stillness that was both freeing and haunting. She stood in her small apartment, the faint glow of streetlights casting shadows across the room. Her phone sat on the table, still buzzing with notifications, messages from her father, her stepmother, even some friend she hadn't spoken to in months. But she didn't open them. Not yet. She wasn't ready. Instead, Sarah's thoughts drifted back to her childhood, to the days when things had been simpler. Before her father remarried, before her stepmother's coldness had taken root in their home. Sarah could almost remember a time when her father had been her hero, the man who held her hand when she was scared, the one who promised to always protect her. But that version of him felt like a distant memory, fading with every passing day. Her mind kept returning to the last conversation they'd had. The words they exchanged were still fresh in her mind. She hadn't expected him to understand, not really. But hearing him say he hadn't known how bad it was, it crushed her. How could he not know? How could he not see what was happening to her, right under his nose? The truth was, Sarah had been invisible for so long that even she had started to believe it. She had been a ghost in her own home, trying to fit into a life that wasn't hers. Now that she had walked away, now that she had stood up for herself, she was left with a deep sense of loss. What did it mean to be seen, to be heard, when the people who were supposed to love you never truly understood? Her phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't a message. It was a call. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she glanced at the screen. Her stepmother's name flashed across it, and for a moment, Sarah froze. Her instinct was to ignore it, to shut it out, but something, some strange force, pushed her to answer. "Hello?" Sarah said, her voice flat. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then her stepmother's voice came through, cold and calculated as always. "Sarah," she said, her tone as sharp as a knife. "We need to talk." "I don't think we have anything to talk about," Sarah replied, trying to keep the bitterness from creeping into her voice. "Oh, I think we do," her stepmother said, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just walk away from your father, from everything we've built? You think your little tantrum will change anything?" Sarah's stomach churned at the words. "You don't know anything about what I've been through," she said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "You've never cared about me. You've never even tried to understand." "That's where you're wrong," her stepmother retorted. "I've always cared about you, Sarah. I've always tried to make you feel welcome in this family, but you never appreciated it. You've always been difficult, always been rebellious. Your father just wants peace, but you want chaos. You've always been a problem." Sarah's hands shook with anger, but she forced herself to stay composed. "You've never been interested in making me feel welcome. You've always treated me like I was nothing more than a servant, someone to do your bidding. And my father," Sarah's voice faltered, the weight of everything she had just said hitting her like a wave. "He's too blind to see it. He never saw me. He never cared." "You're wrong, Sarah," her stepmother said, her voice softer now, almost sweet. "He's doing the best he can. He loves you, you know that. And you're ruining everything by being so dramatic. You're pushing him away. And for what?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The words were a direct hit, and they landed with a force that shook her to the core. It was the same thing she had heard from her father so many times. That she was the problem. That it was her fault that things had gone wrong. That she was the one who had ruined everything. "I'm not ruining anything," Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You and him, both of you, ruined everything a long time ago. I just didn't see it until now." The line went silent for a long moment, and for the first time, Sarah felt a surge of power. She wasn't the one in the wrong. She had never been the problem. She had been fighting for her own survival, fighting for her voice to be heard. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" her stepmother said, her voice darkening. "You think you can just tear this family apart and walk away, leaving us in pieces. But you don't know the whole story, Sarah. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" Her stepmother let out a bitter laugh. "You think your father is so innocent, don't you? You think he's some perfect man who's just been blinded by love. But you don't know everything, Sarah. You don't know what he's done. The secrets he's kept from you." A chill ran down Sarah's spine, and her breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" Her stepmother's voice dropped to a whisper. There's more to this family than you'll ever understand. More than you could ever imagine. You think your father's been the victim in all of this, but you're wrong. He's just as much a part of the problem as I am. Maybe more so. Sarah's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. What do you mean? What are you talking about? But before her stepmother could respond, the line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone in her hand, her mind spinning with confusion and fear. What had her stepmother meant? What secrets were buried in her family's past that she didn't know about? And why had her father never told her? The question gnawed at her, refusing to let go. The thought of her father being involved in something darker, something more sinister than she could have ever imagined, was both terrifying and thrilling. It made her question everything. The life she had known, the love she had trusted, all of it, was it all a lie? In that moment, Sarah realized that she had opened a door that could never be closed. The truth was out there, waiting for her to uncover it. But as much as she longed for the answers, she couldn't shake the fear that knowing the truth might destroy everything she thought she knew about her family. With a heavy heart, Sarah stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the night sky. The road ahead was uncertain, and the future seemed more terrifying than ever. But one thing was clear, she couldn't go back. She had to keep moving forward, even if it meant facing the darkness that lurked in the shadows of her family's past. Sarah takes another significant step in her journey toward discovering the truth. Her conversation with her stepmother introduces a new layer of mystery, secrets hidden in her family's past that could change everything she thought she knew. This cliffhanger sets the stage for the final part of the story, where Sarah will have to confront these hidden truths and the repercussions they may bring. Sarah couldn't remember how long she stood at the window, staring at the night, her mind whirling in circles, trying to make sense of what her stepmother had just said. Her heart beat in her throat, each pulse a sharp reminder that she had no control over what came next. There was a dark undertone to her stepmother's words, a promise of something more, something hidden beneath the surface of her family's carefully constructed life. And for the first time, Sarah felt like she was standing on the edge of an abyss, a place where everything she thought she knew might be ripped apart. The phone call had ended abruptly, and Sarah had been left with more questions than answers. What did her stepmother mean when she said that her father wasn't the victim? That there were secrets buried in the family's past? And why had her father never told her? Sarah's mind raced with the possibilities, but none of them seemed to fit neatly into the life she had lived up until now. It was like everything she had ever trusted, every shred of the family she thought she knew, was slipping through her fingers. She had always believed that her father was the one constant in her life, the one person who would always protect her. But now, she wasn't so sure. How could she trust someone who had kept her in the dark for so long? How could she trust a man who had let her suffer under the hand of her stepmother without ever stepping in to stop it? Sarah's heart ached as she thought of her father. Despite the anger and resentment she felt toward him, there was still a part of her that wanted to believe in him. Wanted to believe that he was the man he once was, the man who had once held her in his arms and promised to keep her safe. But now, the cracks were beginning to show, and she wasn't sure if anything could fill the void that had been left behind. With a deep sigh, Sarah turned away from the window and sat down at the small kitchen table. She hadn't eaten in hours, but she couldn't bring herself to care. All she could think about was what her stepmother had said, about her father's hidden secrets. The words echoed in her mind, drowning out everything else. What could they be? What had her father done that she didn't know about? The fear gnawed at her, but something else was starting to take hold, curiosity. The kind of curiosity that comes when you realize the world you thought you understood is nothing like it seems. She couldn't just ignore what her stepmother had said. She couldn't pretend like it wasn't important. If there was something about her father that had been kept from her, she needed to know. She had to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. But where could she start? Sarah felt a sharp pang in her chest. The thought of confronting her father again was almost unbearable, but it was clear that there was no other way forward. If she wanted answers, she would have to go straight to the source. She needed to ask her father the questions she had been avoiding for so long. And this time, she couldn't allow him to deflect or dodge the truth. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stood up and grabbed her phone. She hesitated for a moment before dialing her father's number. The ringing on the other end seemed to stretch on forever, each passing second making her more nervous. Finally, the call was answered. Sarah, her father's voice was shaky, as though he hadn't expected her to call. Dad, I need to talk to you, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. I know, sweetheart. I know, he replied softly. I know I haven't been there for you, and I'm sorry. But we can work this out. We can talk about everything. No, Dad, Sarah interrupted, her voice firm. This isn't about us working things out. This is about the truth. The truth about everything. About Mom. About you. About what's been going on. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sarah could hear her father breathing, the tension thick between them. She could almost see him, standing in his living room, unsure of what to say. Sarah, his voice cracked, and Sarah could tell he was struggling to keep it together. What are you talking about? I talked to Mom, Sarah said, her voice quiet but resolute. And she told me things. Things about you. Things I didn't know. I need to know if they're true. Her father's silence was deafening, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might hang up on her. But instead, she heard him take a shaky breath. Sarah, he began, his voice tight. There are things in this family's past that you're not ready to hear. Things I've been trying to protect you from. I never meant to hurt you. But some things are better left in the past. No, Sarah said, her voice strong. I'm not a child anymore, Dad. I need to know the truth. All of it. There was a long pause, and then, finally, her father spoke. I'm sorry, Sarah. I never wanted you to find out this way. But I suppose it's time. The words hung in the air, and Sarah's heart beat faster. She had finally cracked the door open, and now there was no turning back. You see, her father began, your mother wasn't the woman I thought she was. When we got married, I was so blinded by my love for her that I couldn't see the signs. But after you were born, things started to change. Slowly at first, but then, it became impossible to ignore. What are you saying, Dad? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Your mother wasn't faithful, her father said softly. She had an affair. With someone close to us. Someone I trusted. I didn't want to believe it, but I found the evidence. I confronted her, and she denied it. But I knew. I knew in my heart. And it tore me apart. Sarah felt like she had been hit by a wave, the ground beneath her feet suddenly giving way. Her mind raced, but she couldn't quite process the words. Who, she finally managed to choke out. Who was it? Her father hesitated. It was your uncle. My brother. The man I trusted most in the world. I didn't want to believe it, but I found the truth. And that's why I had to leave her. I couldn't stay in that marriage, not after what happened. But the worst part is that I never told you. I didn't want to ruin your image of your mother. I wanted you to have something good to hold on to. A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek as the weight of her father's confession settled over her. Her mother, her beautiful, seemingly perfect mother, had betrayed her father in the worst possible way. And her father, in his attempt to protect her, had kept this secret buried for years. I'm sorry, Sarah, her father said, his voice breaking. I should have told you sooner. But I didn't know how. I didn't want you to hate me. I don't hate you, Dad," Sarah said softly, wiping away the tears. "But I can't ignore this. Not anymore." The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Everything Sarah thought she knew about her family had been shattered in an instant. But in a strange way, she felt lighter. The truth had finally come to the surface, and while it was painful, it was also freeing. She could breathe again. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," her father whispered. "I never meant for it to end like this." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But it's over now. We can't change the past. We can only move forward." And as the call ended, Sarah realized something: the past could never be undone, but the future was still hers to shape. The weight of the secret was gone, and she was finally free. Free to live her life on her own terms, without the burden of lies and betrayal.